So previously, I made a video about some of the things that would be standard deduction, so penalties when you're taking the AP exam. These are some things that are errors, and you might have lost credit for. Probably would have on a previous test in my class, but will not be penalized. And the reason it's not penalized, a couple things. It's one, it's some of these are sort of hard to make judgments on. So to try to ensure fairness, they just decide, okay, we're not going to deduct any penalties for that. And also because it is such a small test and these are relatively small things, you can't really penalize these without having, penalizing it for more than it's probably justified. So, obviously try to avoid making mistakes, but some of these are some things you can get away with. So you don't need to freak out too much about the minutia. All right. So first, if you have extra code, so long as it doesn't have a side effect, right? So let's say you do something that's not necessary, but as long as it doesn't break things, you're okay. If you do something in 5 lines of code that you could do in 2 or 3, that's fine. Actually, sometimes it can make things more clear if you stretch it out a little bit, but that's not going to cause a problem. Or if you do a check, um, let's say you do a check on the length of the array, which isn't strictly necessary, that's fine as well. Okay. Also, you can get away with spelling discrepancies or case discrepancies so long as you don't have another variable. Like you can't have a variable called A and another one called A and then use them interchangeably. But if you just have a variable called A and then later you refer to it with a capital A, that you can get away with. Not that you'd be particularly likely to do that, but you might forget to make something camel case that you previously made camel case, and they're not going to adjudicate that or sit there and determine whether you did an upper or lowercase c. All right. Local variable not declared, provided other variables are declared. So as long as you're making variable declarations generally, if you miss one of them, let's say you have like you start and you have like a count equals 0 or something like that, instead of saying int count equals 0, you can get away with that. So that's just an example of the type of thing that you might do. Let me erase this, clear some space. Okay. What else? Um, Public or private, if you use those when it's not really needed for a local variable, that's okay. Or if you miss public when you're doing your constructor. But go ahead, write public, do what you're used to. Obviously, you don't want to do these things, but if you do, it's not a big deal. Keyword, if you accidentally use a keyword, a word as a identifier, then like for example, if you used, if you declared an int called double, which represented double a previous quantity or something like that, normally you wouldn't be able to do that because obviously double is a reserved word, but it's going to let you get away with it. Also, it's easy about the mathematical symbols that you use. Part of this is because one of the ways you could do this is writing it on paper. So if you use like a dot instead of an asterisk to represent multiplication, or even like a times, as long as it's clear what you're doing, that's fine. As long as some accepted way to represent multiplication, it will assume that you're doing a multiplication there. Also, if you get confused between brackets and parentheses or these sort of, I don't even know exactly what to call them. This symbol, which is used to define a specific variable that goes into an array list, the less than greater than symbol used in that context, that's okay. It'll just sort of assume what you meant to do. Likewise, with a single versus a double equal sign, obviously, normally that can get you in a lot of trouble when you're trying to write your code, but in this case, it'll just be assumed that you meant to do the correct thing, whether you're comparing or setting something equal. Um, this whole length versus size, you know how it's kind of confusing because for an array list, you use size with the brackets at the end. For a string, you would use length with the parentheses, And for an array, you use length without the parentheses. So there's stuff to remember. It's easy to get confused, but if you do happen to make a mistake on that, you're not going to be penalized. If you refer to an array, so let's say you have an array called array that's called R. If you were referring to the whole thing, you would normally just call it ARR. But if you know, slapped on this at the end and referred to it as array with the brackets, then it would let you get away with that. Um, this next one shouldn't really be relevant. Some of you, if you programmed in different languages, sometimes you use for a two-dimensional array, use something like this rather than something like this. But there's going to be no two-dimensional arrays on this year's exam anyway, so that really should not be an issue. Also, if you kind of put an extra size in when you're defining an array, that's not going to be a big deal. Missing semicolons if it's obvious. So, if you write a line of code and you forget to put a semicolon in one or two places, as long as you're going down to the next line after it, then you're not going to be penalized for that. Likewise um, with brackets, with um, missing if you don't have a parameter. So I guess if you have a void method or a constructor and you forget to do the parentheses, that's okay. But I don't see how you would be able to successfully convey that you're putting a parameter in without doing those. So, if it does take a parameter, you kind of need to have those. Um, Also, if you forget them around the if conditions. So this basically, it's just anticipating some of the really kind of sloppy little mistakes that you might make, where you can understand what's going on anyway. And that's kind of the guiding principle. If it's clear what you're trying to do and you make a minor syntax error, for the purposes of this exam, you can get away with it. That's not really a problem. So hopefully that might put you to ease a little bit. Obviously, you do want to write your code correctly, but these type of little mistakes are not going to undo you on exam day. Okay, that's all. Thanks.